Welcome to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. Here you'll find the intersection between faith and mental health. I'm your host, Camille. I'm a licensed therapist and clinical social worker, but more importantly, I'm a Christian who really loves the Lord. And I'm just trying to navigate this life without falling victim to it, just like everyone else. Here we take a faith-based approach to all things mental health and wellness, because the Bible tells us to guard our heart and mind, and sometimes we need a little bit of help with that. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. I am really excited about today's episode. I hope that you all are doing well, that you're having a good week so far. It's about halfway through the week. So how are we doing? Little midweek check-in. You made it and you're almost there. So I believe in you. You can make it. All right. Today's episode, I feel like it's been a long time coming. We're going to be talking about relationships and attachment. We have mentioned relationships in past episodes, and there's a lot more that probably could be said than what we're going to get through in this episode. So this is at least the first time that we're going to be talking about relationships and attachment. We may or may not revisit it at a later date. Don't hold me to it. But I was really having to kind of edit my thoughts about this because there were so many and they were going in so many different directions. There's a lot to be said about attachment and relationships. That is one of the theoretical principles that I lean on heavily in my work with clients. And so I have lots of thoughts about it, but it has come up in the context of how we are able to show up and navigate our relationship with God. And so it makes sense to really look at our relationship history and our attachment styles and what we have learned in relationships in the past so that we can have a better understanding of some of the things that are interacting with our relationship with God. So that's what we're getting into today. Now, whether we like it or not, if we're going to talk about attachment, then we have to talk about our families. I know a lot of times we want to separate our present day lives from our past, and intellectually we might be able to do that. But emotionally and even physically, our nervous system is not really able to separate and contextualize in that way. Our first and primary examples of love and connection follow us into every single relationship that we get into afterwards. Everyone develops what we call an attachment style, and that is pretty solely based on the relationship that you have with your primary caregiver, with your parent, with whoever raised you. So the way that you navigate loving relationships in adulthood is very much based on what you were taught about relationships in your upbringing. Now, for some of us, we might have some different kind of feelings about that. We might have some different feelings about our upbringing or about what those relationships were like. If you came from a household with loving parents, there probably are still some things that you might that you might not want to carry into your other relationships. And if you came from a home where there was abuse and neglect, then you definitely don't want to intentionally perpetuate those things. But as we grow and develop, the things that we learn about connection and about attachment and about vulnerability are inherently taught to us when we're children and when we're babies and when we're infants. We have relationships with people who exist outside of us way before we have any cognitive understanding of who God is, or before we even have the ability to decide whether or not we want to be in relationships with people. We exist in the context of relationships. Our families exist in the context of relationships. And so we learn so much about the world from those first and primary relationships. So as we're talking today, yes, our experiences come from past romantic partners and platonic friendships, but I do want you to think about what were some of those relationships like with your primary caregivers. And that's going to kind of set the foundation for the way that you understand, perceive, and conceptualize relationships moving forward. We take the communication patterns, the level of emotional availability, and our trust issues that we gain or that we learn from those primary relationships, and we take them into all relationships moving forward, even our relationship with God. And that's where we really want to spend some time today. All right, so like I mentioned, we all develop an attachment style that's based on our family of origin or the people who raised you. That could be your biological parents, that could be an extended family member, that could be an adopted family, that could be anyone. So whoever raised you and did the majority of your child rearing, that's who we're talking about when we say family of origin. Ooh, I can already feel it. Y'all, I'm in my therapist bag today. This is going to be an educational episode. So that's our family of origin. So we have relationships with people that affect our brain development from infancy. We start developing as soon as we come into this world, and all the things that exist in the world around us affect the way that our brain develops, including and primarily our relationships with other people. This idea of attachment is universally accepted and recognized, so much so that there is a whole psychological theory that's built around it called, you guessed it, attachment theory. And that theory essentially states that someone's ability to form normal social and emotional development or connection is dependent on their relationship with one or both of their caregivers in infancy and in childhood, which means that there is research to back this up. I say that because I can't tell you how many people have tried to say, oh, yeah, no, my relationship with my parents doesn't bother me. It doesn't affect me now. Well, maybe not consciously. Maybe there are some things that you are able to intentionally separate, or that you are able to intentionally reject from the way that you were brought up. But subconsciously, it absolutely affects the way that you understand the world around you. So before we go any further, please accept and recognize that your relationship with your parents or with your primary caregivers did and does affect you still, and the way that you navigate relationships. The good news in that is that, as we talk more about some of the different attachment styles and what some of that means, the good news is that some of these maybe unhealthy ways that we've learned to relate to other people is not necessarily our fault. Now that's good, because we don't want to put unnecessary blame and shame on ourselves for the way that we navigate relationships. If you didn't have a choice, if it's all you knew, then of course it's all you're going to do. So immediately we want to try to neutralize some of that shame that can come with the awareness of some of our unhealthy relationship habits. So get that shame out of here. It wasn't your fault. The adults in your life did what they knew how to do, and you were on the receiving end of that, good and bad. So that's first things. So there are a total of 4 attachment styles: secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized. Now, secure attachment, that is the goal. That's the ideal attachment style. Secure attachment means that each person's emotional needs are effectively being expressed and met throughout the course of the relationship. They are being met on a consistent basis, which leads to a greater level of emotional vulnerability and intimacy. Now, there are a lot of different ways that we can get to secure attachment, but generally speaking, there are 3 primary components to secure attachment. Those components are emotional accessibility, vulnerability, and responsiveness to needs. Essentially, in secure attachment, you are feeling safe, seen, and soothed. Without those things, you do not have secure attachment. That's not to say that there are not other things that contribute to safe or secure attachment, but without those, it doesn't exist. What's at the root of secure attachment is safety, emotional safety, mental and emotional safety. Physical safety, of course, as well. Let's not negate that, but safety, essentially. Now, if you think back to your family of origin and the people that raised you, the way that you were raised, what kind of safety was there? Was there that emotional safety? Was there emotional availability? Was there a responsiveness to your needs, all of your needs, not just food and clothing and shelter, but your emotional needs as well? Were you able to be vulnerable and to share when you were struggling or making mistakes? Were those things present on a consistent basis in your environment? If so, then it's likely that you have developed a secure attachment style from there. And if not, then you probably fall into one of the other 3 categories of attachment. Now, we won't go too deep into the other 3 attachment styles, but when we mention or when we reference insecure attachment, it's typically one of these 3 attachment styles. So we have anxious attachment, which is typically the result of emotional inconsistency. We have avoidant attachment, which is typically the result of emotional withholding. And then we have disorganized attachment, also known as fearful avoidant attachment, which is typically the result of childhood abuse and neglect, severe abuse and neglect in childhood. So again, while secure attachment is the goal, we want our emotional needs to be valued and prioritized. That's the goal. But most of us fall into one of these other three categories of attachment styles. And if you do, that's okay. Now, let me also say this. I think that it's possible for you to have developed a secure attachment style in childhood, but if you were involved in an abusive relationship later on in life, I do think that it's possible for your attachment style to shift from being secure to being more anxious or being more avoidant, because it's still shaped based on our experiences. But I think that it would take a really toxic relationship to change your attachment style from secure to something else. When we fall into one of these insecure attachment styles, that usually leads to some pretty serious trust issues. Now, I'm sure that when I say trust issues, there are some things that are coming up for everyone. You have either been on the receiving end of someone else who had some trust issues, or maybe you were projecting your trust issues onto another person. Either way, we can probably agree that having challenges with trust makes any relationship difficult, and it makes it really difficult to sustain it, which is why I think it's important that we spend some time talking about this. These type of trust issues are really rooted in fear and not only expectation, but I think anticipation of repeating the same emotional experiences that you had in childhood. Think about it this way. If what you learned about relationships and about how to interact with people in the world was full of emotional inconsistency or withholding or abuse and neglect, then what that's going to tell you is that, generally speaking, this is how people are with each other. That's going to be your universal understanding of relationships. And so we bring those experiences to everyone else that we come into contact with. It's not intentional, but that's just the way that you understand the world around you. And these trust issues, of course, are going to manifest differently in different people. But some examples of what it might look like are this fear of being hurt. That's a big one that we hear a lot. I don't want to be hurt. I don't want to be betrayed again, or I don't want the heartbreak, or we're trying to avoid any real or perceived pain. We also have this fear of abandonment and rejection. If we have a fear of abandonment or rejection, what that essentially means is that we are convinced that the person that we're in a relationship with is looking for any excuse to reject or abandon us. So we're always on edge. That's a big one with anxious attachment, is that fear of rejection or abandonment. It's actually in all of them. I won't even say that. It just shows up differently, I think, depending on the type of person that you are and depending on your personality and your character. It shows up differently, but that's at the root of a lot of these trust issues, and it's at the root of all of these insecure attachment styles. We tend to be very guarded emotionally when we have trust issues. We don't know if we can trust the other person. When we enter into relationships, you kind of fall into one of two categories. Either you're the kind of person who says, I'm going to trust you until you give me a reason not to, or you're on the opposite, which says, I do not trust you until you earn my trust or until you prove to me that I can. Now, if you fall into the second category, then when you're entering into any kind of relationship with another person, you're pretty guarded emotionally. Your walls are up, your defenses are up, because you're going in with the assumption that this person cannot and should not be trusted, which makes it difficult to kind of connect with people and to have that emotional intimacy because you're already suspicious of this person. I get how it happens, but when we think about what it takes and the kind of relationships that we actually want, this approach, I don't know if it's really conducive to finding the type of relationships that we want and that we believe will be beneficial to us. Another thing with these trust issues in our attachment is that we tend to be in this chronic survival mode. Our fight or flight is ready to kick in at any moment. Sometimes that might look like making a mountain out of a molehill. Something very small will happen, but you'll blow it up and it feels like this big, huge thing. Or you might do something, you might, make a mistake and then you're like, well, I might as well leave. I'm packing up my bags now. There's like this overreaction to things where we're picking arguments left and right. We have this mindset of, well, I'm going to reject you before you can reject me. All of that is a trauma response. And we're existing in this survival mode because we believe that we can only trust ourselves. Now, I want to be really sensitive when we're talking about this because I know that a lot of us have experienced some pretty extreme trauma in our relationships. And I don't want to minimize any of that. And I know that sometimes when we talk about these things in more casual ways, that can have a way of minimizing or diminishing the really painful experiences that we've gone through. That's not at all what we want to do. But I think that by talking about trust issues and attachment in this way, it helps us to see some of the decisions that we're making either consciously or unconsciously. Now, one of my big encouragements for everyone on any healing journey that you're on is to prioritize awareness. You cannot make any kind of change or growth if you're not first aware of where you're starting from and all the different things that are involved in where you're starting. So that's one of the reasons that I like to talk about these things in like layman's terms and in ways that that might feel very direct, because I need us to look at ourselves. I need us to see ourselves. And by seeing yourself, you're also seeing all the things that have contributed to who you are now. That's important because it gives us, I think, a more well-rounded view of our own experience and of who we are as a person. And my hope and prayer is that that well-rounded view will neutralize some of that shame. If you listen to, I can't remember which episode, one of the recent episodes, we talked about what is the narrative or the story that you're telling about yourself and about who you are. Do you see yourself as the villain, or do you see yourself as the protagonist? But that is another way kind of saying, like, if you only see yourself in this one way, then we could be negating all the things that you've had to overcome in order to get where you are. And that is as much of a part of your story as the trauma that you went through. It's as much a part of your story as these perceived failures and missteps that you have made. And you do yourself a disservice when you only focus on the negative things and don't focus on the resiliency and strength that it took to overcome some of those things. Okay, that's a bit of a tangent, but I think it was necessary. When we have trust issues, essentially, we have a problem with emotional safety. We don't know what it feels like. We don't know how to have it. We don't think that we can keep it. We feel like we can't trust it. We feel like it's a myth. But that emotional safety, right? That's what we talked about in the secure attachment. That is what we need. And a lot of times what I find is that it comes down to, we feel like we can't trust it. If a person is wanting to connect with you and they are being direct and communicative and they're respecting your boundaries and they are wanting to spend time with you and they're able to have difficult conversations with you without avoiding you, all of these things that we say we want, a lot of times when we're presented with them, we feel like we can't trust them because we've never seen them before. And what we have learned about relationships is none of those things. Okay? If you grew up in chaos and in emotional abuse, then that is what you expect from other people. So when someone shows up and they are not being emotionally abusive and they're not being chaotic, then you feel very suspicious of that sometimes. And you're like, I don't know if I can trust you. Or you feel like you don't deserve it and like you can't trust yourself and I'm definitely going to ruin it. And that's right back into the self-sabotage that we've talked about before. So the trust issues can really show up in a lot of different ways. It can be your lack of trust in someone else, and or it can be your lack of trust in yourself. So in your reflection time, think about what it looks like for you. Does it show up more in the way that you perceive other people or in the way that you perceive yourself in relationships? So since fear is at the root of a lot of these trust issues, when these things present themselves, all these different signs that you have a hard time trusting people, when these things present themselves, we have to assess whether the fear with this person in particular is real or perceived. I want to stress the importance that we need to assess whether the fear with this person is real or perceived, because there are some people that are not trustworthy. We can say that, okay? I don't want to make it seem like everyone is trustworthy and that you're wrong for being cautious when you're entering into relationships with other people. That would be unwise, okay? And we do need to use wisdom and discernment when we are evaluating and assessing who are healthy people to have in our lives. Everyone is not trustworthy, but at the same time, everyone is not untrustworthy either. We have to take each relationship and each person on a case-by-case basis. It's not fair to have this universal rule of relationships because each person is so different. And that universal rule can make you biased and it can really make you miss your blessing and miss people who could really pour into you in some meaningful ways because you're making an assumption based on your experiences. And we do that a lot. So When you're making a connection with a new person, you want to assess whether the fear with this person in particular is real or perceived. Now, if you fall into one of the three insecure attachment styles, and there probably is going to be some fear that comes up for you, because that comes up for you in all relationships. And so you're going to be able to tell better than I can, what is the fear that you're trying to assess? What is the specific fear that you're trying to place, or to see if it really is appropriate and has a place here? Is it a fear of not being prioritized, not being seen, not being valued? Is it a fear of that rejection or abandonment that we talked about? Is it a fear of manipulation? Like, what is it for you specifically? So you're going to have to take some time and really try to understand and unpack what's at the root of your trust issues. Now, my recommendation would be to unpack that with a mental health professional, because like we said before, it's difficult for us sometimes to see our own stuff. What's that saying? You can't see the forest for the trees, right? It's really hard for you to see your own stuff, but also all you know is your own worldview. So it's difficult sometimes to perceive what it might be like to think about things differently. And so having a professional walk you through these things can be really helpful in exposing some of the fears that's at the root of your trust issues for you. And our trust issues don't always show up in the ways that we think they're going to show up. So you may not even recognize it. You may just be going about your merry little day and not even realize that there's this pattern that you have that actually is a result of not being able to trust people. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I know this is a thing, okay? I know this is a thing. And if you've been in therapy before, then you know it's a thing as well. You know that the therapist has probably held up a mirror to you and has shown you, well, this actually sounds like you are very empathetic and understanding in other people, because it's a defense mechanism. You feel like if you can understand them, then you can be who they want you to be, and then they won't hurt you. So that actually is an issue with trusting people. Something like that. Something that you wouldn't think relates to trust, because it don't look like it. But we all have things and patterns that are difficult for us to see, and it's helpful for someone else to point it out to you. So that's your therapy plug for today. So you might be asking, okay, Camille, well, then how do we navigate relationships without projecting our trust issues onto other people? How do we navigate relationships wisely then? Since you're so smart, since you got your degree, what are we supposed to do? Okay, I got you. That answer is going to vary for each person, but a general distinction that needs to be made is whether or not you are mistrusting of other people, or if you are projecting your fears onto them. So similar to what we were saying before, assessing whether or not this fear is real in this person. Are they really not trustworthy, or am I projecting my fears onto them, and have I really not given them a chance? Now, let me also say, relationships are risky. Relationships are high risk, high reward. There is no guarantee that they're going to work out. And sometimes we convince ourselves that that means it's not even worth trying. I understand, especially if you've had a lot of relationships fail in the past, we feel like it's not even worth trying, because what if it doesn't work out? But on the other side, what if it does work out? Like, the reward is also really, really high if they do work out. And this might just be the hopeless romantic in me, but I'm always going to be a proponent for connection and relationships, even if they're risky. I'm talking to myself too, y'all. Please understand, I'm talking to myself as well. Girl, you got to keep trying. You got to put yourself out there. Okay, now. Something else to think about is the way that you make decisions in and about your relationships. You want to look at whether or not your decisions are being made based on these fears that we talked about before. So do you have fear-based decision-making when it comes to your relationships with other people? What that might look like is having this what-if mentality, or waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? What if they lose interest? What if they don't want to be my friend anymore? What if they find somebody who is better than me? What if they're just trying to use me for what I have? That what-if mentality, along with waiting for the other shoe to drop, is too good to be true. That's a fear-based decision. When you are being motivated by the past, and if everything that you're doing in this relationship is an attempt at trying to avoid a past hurt, that's a fear-based decision. If you are trying to predict certain outcomes and trying to control the certain outcomes, that's a fear-based decision as well, because the need for control is based in fear again. In recording all these episodes, I did not anticipate talking about fear so much. We are just very, very fearful as a people. And I believe that that is a tool of the enemy because he's the great deceiver. And I think that he has deceived us a lot to believe that we need to be fearful and that we ought to be fearful. But God has not given us a spirit of fear, okay? So when the fear is at the forefront of your decision making, then you know who else is at the forefront of your decision making, and it's not God. All right, I'm getting ahead of myself. When we are in this survival mode in relationships, then we tend to sometimes make impulsive decisions that are coming from a place of panic or a place of urgency. Again, that is based and rooted in fear, but there's still no safety in that. Even though that is the driving force for a lot of this is the need for safety, there's no safety in making these decisions that are based in fear. One of the hard truths that I often have to break to people is that relationships are hard. All relationships are hard. All meaningful relationships are hard. They're hard because they take effort. And I think that there's this myth that if you really love someone, that it should come easy. And that is simply untrue. I think a lot of us probably have been in friendships or relationships or situations where we felt like there was not enough effort being put in. That's what happens when you think that things should just come easy. You can tell, or you feel like you're the only one who's putting in effort. You're the only one who's like trying to make it work. And that in itself is its own like special kind of heartbreak, right? That lack of reciprocation that we feel a lot. And if you have experienced any form of heartbreak, really, I can absolutely understand and empathize with the fact that you might want to avoid it at all costs. That lack of reciprocation has been my specific form of heartbreak that I've experienced. And I think I'm still figuring out how to navigate that in relationships now without completely closing myself off. But that heartbreak turned into a lot of different things in me and really made me question myself a whole lot. And that is no way to enter into a relationship, with questioning yourself, questioning your value, questioning your worth. And so, of course, my mindset on it now is it has made me be more passive in relationships at times, because I feel like, well, if I'm the one taking all the initiative and putting all the effort, then how do I know that the other person actually wants to be in relationship with me? Now, to be quite honest, I don't know if I've really found the answer to that yet. I'm still figuring it out. I think I made some progress, but that was a big one for me. And I became more passive because I didn't want to experience that heartbreak of realizing that I was the only one putting effort into something, because I was the only one who was prioritizing it, because I was the only one who really wanted it, and the other person was like okay with having it. If you've been there, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. So as I'm navigating relationships now, specific kind of relationships, that's what I'm trying to avoid. I don't want to feel like I have to try to convince anyone to be in connection with me. I don't want to have to convince anyone that I'm like worthy of it. That made me feel really, really, really small. But I say all that to say that regardless of whatever type of heartbreak you've experienced, whether it was in a form of betrayal, rejection, abandonment, or abuse, we learn from those experiences that all relationships have the potential or the capacity to harm us in similar ways. And that makes us much more fearful when connecting with other people or in opening ourselves up to other people, because we are opening ourselves up to being hurt again. And that takes a lot of courage. That takes a whole lot of courage. I'm going to do it, y'all. I'm going to do it because we need people and we need relationships, but it is really, really difficult. So be patient with yourself and give yourself grace. But I hope and pray that that's the goal that you're working towards. What I hate to see is this belief that develops from a result of this heartbreak that it's just better and safer just to be alone. And I'm just going to isolate and just be by myself on this little island instead, right? I refuse to become that person. I definitely have been that person, but I know that we are created for connection, and there is so much love and benefit and blessings in community and in connection with other people. So resist the urge to isolate. I know I'm talking to somebody right now. Resist the urge to isolate, because you're going to find the people who want to be there. You're going to find the people who want to keep you safe. Even if you haven't found them yet, I promise they're out there. Again, I'm talking to myself as well. But when we become avoidant, and when all of our effort goes to trying to make sure that we're not hurt in the same ways, we don't often make the distinction between our relationships with other people and our relationships with God. It just kind of goes into the relationship bucket in general. And so we learn that it's possible to be hurt in these similar ways in all relationships, even in our relationship with God. There's this interesting thing that happens in relationships, and when we have these attachment issues, what happens is that while on one level, we are trying to grasp at any sense of emotional safety, and we are relying on that person to provide us with emotional safety, we are also simultaneously anticipating and expecting the other person to hurt us. It's weird, but it's like two sides of the same coin. I am hoping and expecting that you will keep me safe and meet my needs. And I am expecting and anticipating that you will not meet my needs. You will not keep me safe, and you will hurt me. So there's this push-pull that we feel a lot, especially in anxious attachment. There's this push-pull because I want you close, but I don't think that you want to be close to me. Or I want you close, but I am scared that when you get close, that's when you're going to take the chance to hurt me. So it's this simultaneous kind of expectation that we have of someone else. And that's a lot to put on anyone. That's a lot to put on anyone, and it makes our relationships feel so unstable and so fragile. It makes me anxious just talking about it. You want someone to keep you safe, and you expect that same person who you want to keep you safe, you also expect them to hurt you. So how can you trust they're going to keep you safe if you believe that they're going to hurt you? How do those two things coexist? How do you have a stable relationship when that is the mindset that's in it? And when it comes to our relationships with God, we have a tendency of projecting those same expectations onto Him. We expect God to protect us from any and all pain, not only the pain in the context of this relationship, because He's God, right? And so since He's God, that expectation applies to every single area of your life. God, I expect you to protect me from pain at work. I expect you to protect me from pain in grief. I expect you to protect me from pain in relationships. I expect you to protect me from pain financially. We expect God to make sure that we do not experience any kind of pain. And when we inevitably experience pain and suffering, then we feel as though God has rejected and or abandoned us, which is simply not the case. God never promised life without pain. In fact, He guaranteed pain. What's that verse that says, why every time I'm trying to quote a verse, it goes away? Something about the man's days are short, but full of pain or full of trouble, something like that. Pain and suffering in life is guaranteed. So He never promised that we would not experience pain. He promised that He would never leave us alone in our pain. Those are two different things. We have got to get that in our spirit. It's really sad when I see people turn away from God because they're going through difficult seasons. We have to get that in our spirit. There is going to be pain. There is going to be suffering. God is not going to leave you in that pain and in that suffering, which is what makes Him different from some of the people who have left you in the past. Some of us have been in experiences where people have left us when we've gone through difficult things, or when we've needed them the most, they were not there. That's not God. God is ever present. We might pull away from Him when we're going through difficult things, but He has not moved. He's still as close to us as He always was. He's as accessible to us as He always was. So we got to detach from this idea that pain and suffering equals an absence of God's presence. That's not a thing. That's not a thing. Instead, we want to adopt this idea that we can lean into God's presence when we experience pain and suffering, so that He can provide us comfort and strength to get us through these seasons of pain and suffering. Pain and heartbreak are unavoidable. They are a part of the human experience. Unfortunately, sorry, pipe, They're a part of the human experience. The good news is that heartbreak, like all emotions, is temporary. Now, temporary might still be a long time. Now, it might still be a while. It might be a couple months, might be a couple years, but it is temporary. It is seasonal, and seasons come to an end. And I think that makes it a little bit less threatening, because as painful as some of these seasons may be, we know that there's life on the other side of it. We know that this painful season isn't the end all be all, because it's temporary. There's life and joy on the other side of it. So when we go through these seasons and we're so angry at God because he's allowed us to go through these seasons, or because the choices that we have made have brought us into some of these seasons, and in that moment, it feels like the pain that you're going through is permanent and is the worst thing that you've ever experienced. And in some cases, it might be the worst thing that you've experienced to date. That does not change the ever-present nature of God. That does not change the authority of God. That's what we can trust. We can trust who God is because he's always been the same God. He's the same God now that he was for David, for Abraham, for Isaac. He's the same exact God, okay? He has never changed and has never wavered. So if you're not sure like where to put your trust in God, or if you're trying to strengthen that trust, just start with that. Can you trust that he has not changed? Can you trust that he's the same God that we read about in the Bible? Can you trust that? If you can start there, then you're well on your way. The question is not whether or not you will experience pain and heartbreak in this lifetime. The question becomes, do you believe that God can and will be with you and carry you through the heartbreak? We all want to trust God, but that's easier said than done, right? It's easy to say, I'm going to trust God. Boom. All of a sudden now you trust him. Like it don't work that way, right? Especially if you know and can really be honest with yourself and acknowledge that some of these trust issues from other people have shown up in your relationship with God. It's way easier said than done. So what does it look like to trust God? Like, how do I know if I'm going in the right direction? And again, it's going to come back to the way that you make decisions, the way that you make decisions in your relationships with other people, the way that you make decisions about your life in general. So a few things to look for. When you are making decisions that are based on your faith and trust in God, we're not rushing through these decisions. There is not that sense of urgency that we feel sometimes when we're coming from a place of fear. And a part of that reason is because we are seeking God's guidance on it first. When we are moving from a place of urgency and a place of fear, we're not always taking the time to consider all of the contributing factors, but also we're not always taking the time to seek God's voice and his guidance in something first. We're just making the decision based on what we feel in that moment. And we're making them from panic. We're making them from a fearful place. So when we are making decisions that are based on faith and trust, we're not rushing and we are seeking God's guidance first. We're also using more discernment and more wisdom. I think that's something that comes with slowing down. When you slow down and you're really thoughtful, then you can really kind of consider all the different options. You can look for God in every option. I like to ask myself, is this decision going to bring me closer to God or further away from him? So take the time to really ask those questions and to find him in whatever potential outcomes you're considering here, and in whatever potential relationships you're considering. That's a big one. Okay, that's a big one. When you're considering relationships with other people, friendships or otherwise. Now, if we could just be honest, a lot of what we're talking today, I think, is applying to romantic relationships, especially because that is where we see our broken attachment the most. Your romantic and intimate relationships most closely mirror your relationships with your parents and primary caregivers, whether we wanted to or not. Okay, whether we wanted to or not. So if you are entering into a relationship with a person, or you're entertaining a situation with the person, ask yourself, is this person going to bring me closer to God or further away? Ask yourself and be honest now. Okay? Be honest. We've been there. I've been there. Okay, I'm the first one to say it. I have been there in trying to convince myself. Ooh, silly girl. In trying to convince myself that maybe one day they could know God, or maybe, they acknowledge who he is and or that he exists at least, and that's better than nothing. And girl, no, if you have to justify it and rationalize it that much, the answer is no. Sorry. The answer is simply no. So we need to use that discernment, okay? When we're making decisions that are based on faith and trust, we feel a different level of safety. Let me just speak for myself. There is a level of safety that I feel in relinquishing control to God, in the sense that I am going to ask him about every major decision I'm making in my life, major and minor decision, if I'm honest. I'm gonna ask him about it first, okay? And if I get that confirmation from God, I can trust that more than I can trust myself. And so I feel safe with that decision if it has been influenced by God. Now, in contrast to when we're moving in fear, when we're moving in faith, we're motivated by the present and the future possibilities, less by the past. We're less about trying to avoid certain things from the past, and we're thinking about the things that we want to invite into our lives in the present and in the future. And that allows us to be at peace with the uncertainty, I think, a little bit more, because we have a certainty in who God is. I may not know for certain what's going to happen next, if it's going to work out with this person, how long they'll be in my life, but I know for certain who God is and that his character is never changing. And honestly, that's the most important relationship to me. So if I can at least trust the character of the one that I'm in the most important relationship with, then it's going to make it easier to deal with whatever these other people bring to my life. Notice I said easier, not easy, because it's still hard, okay? Relationships are still hard. They still take time. They still take work. They still take effort. But if I can fall back on the trust that I have in God and in who he is and in his consistency and his present nature, then it's easier for me to have peace with the uncertainty that other people provide and offer. So it may be a while before you can learn to trust people. If you are starting from the opposite end of the spectrum and you really believe that you can't trust anybody, it probably will take a while before you can learn that you can trust people. And it's probably going to take some very patient people to come into your life and be willing to kind of stand in the wings with you and help you as you walk through this journey. But in the meantime, you can learn to trust God. I believe it's easier to trust God than it is to trust people because he's God. Okay? So to help you get started on that journey of trusting God, here are some questions to think about. Okay, take out your journals. We've got some reflection questions. Okay, question number 1. What does God need to heal in you in order to heal your relationships? Is it bitterness? Is it fear? Is it insecurity? Is it trauma? What does God need to heal in you in order to heal your relationships, current existing relationships or new relationships moving forward? Number 2. What negative beliefs are you bringing to your relationship with God? Is it that you are maybe too much or not enough for God because that's what you believe about other people? Maybe not wanting to be a burden to God, not wanting to bring your stuff to him because you feel like he has more important things to handle, not needing him because you don't like to rely on people. So then that makes you not want to rely on God. What are the negative beliefs and patterns that you're bringing into your relationship with God? Number 3, are you punishing God for man's mistake? That one's pretty self-explanatory. Are you punishing God for man's mistake? Meaning, are you treating him like you would treat someone who has already hurt you in the past? Are you punishing God for man's mistakes? And then lastly, can you think of a time that God broke his promise? That's not to say, can you think of a time where God didn't do what you wanted him to do? Can you think of a time where God broke his promise? God gave us the perfect example of a loving and secure attachment. The pain and heartbreak that you've experienced in your relationships was because human beings got it wrong, not because God got it wrong. God has never changed the way that he loves us or the extent that he loves us. When I think about how much God loves me, it is truly, truly overwhelming. How much he loved me before I even existed, before my parents even existed. That has not changed. My plea to you, if you are struggling in trusting God, is to start with trusting that he is still the same God that sent his son to die for your sins. If you believe that he's still that same God, then you can trust that he's that same God now. And find comfort in knowing that even though we fail each other as humans sometimes, God is too holy and he is too good to ever fail us like that. And that is a blessing. Okay, so Let's go to our scripture for the day. Let's see what the word has to say about some of this. So today's scripture is a pretty common one, pretty well known. We're coming from Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 today. I remember one of the churches that I went to when I was in college, we used to repeat this scripture before the sermon every single week. It was like a call and response, but so it's been ingrained in my mind ever since. But it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Or another translation says, and he will direct your path. The part that I really want to focus on is verse 5 that says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. This is really big when it comes to relationships because, like we said earlier, our understanding of relationships comes from our experiences of being hurt and let down by other people. If that's what we're using to guide us in relationships with others and in relationships with God, then we are more than likely to miss the mark. Encountering God based on our own understanding of him and of relationships, it gives us a very limited view of who he is, and it limits our access to him, I think. It makes us resistant to trust him, and it makes us convince ourselves that we're somehow safer not trusting him at all, not trusting anyone at all. So that contributes to that isolation when we lean on our own understanding sometimes. Our own understanding will lead us further away from God instead of closer to him. When we've been hurt a lot in relationships, it can be difficult to fathom that it's possible to have a relationship or that someone actually might have good intentions. It's hard to fathom the fact that you don't have to try to convince someone to be with you or to stay with you or that you're worthy of love and affection. It's hard to fathom that a relationship may not be purely transactional. And so when we lean on our own understanding of those things, it is hard to imagine or fathom the unconditional love that God offers simply because he created us. Our own understanding keeps us away from that truth. But you don't really have to understand it in order to believe it. The Bible says that God's ways are above our ways and his thoughts are above our thoughts, which means that I would never be able to understand or comprehend why he loves me the way that he does. But I choose to trust that God does love me that way. I choose to trust that he is good and that he is always working things out for my good, even if other people aren't. And so that's my encouragement to you as well. All right. We're almost done, y'all, I promise. We are finally at the question and answer portion of our show. We have our listener question of the week. If you have questions that you want to be answered on the show, you can send them to me via email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com. If you are watching on YouTube, then drop some questions in the comments and you'll probably see them show up in a later episode. You can shoot me a DM wherever. But if you have questions, please send them to me. I would love to answer them. I really want to know that the topics that I'm talking about are speaking directly to what it is that you are going through. Okay, so today's question is, I feel like God is telling me to do something, but I don't know how. It leaves me feeling lost, confused, and honestly a little frustrated. What do I do? Great question. Fantastic question. If you believe that God is giving you instruction or direction, or he's telling you to do something, know that he's going to give you more instruction and guidance until his will is completed. If God has given you an assignment, he's not just going to drop one sentence to you and then not give you anything else about it. All right. But sometimes God gives us a word and then it's days, weeks, months, maybe even years until he gives us another word. And in the meantime, when God gives us something, at least this is how it's happened in my life, it's not always a complete vision or a complete assignment. It's like a piece of something. And I think that's when it's our responsibility to lock it away in our heart and keep talking to God about it and to meditate on it and to seek his guidance and wisdom on it and to be open to the other things that God might be doing in our life that could also speak to the word that he gave you or to the assignment that you believe that he gave you. I have definitely made the mistake of trying to act on what I thought God was telling me too soon. And I ended up hurting my own feelings when I did that. I've been in spaces where I felt like God was telling me something, or maybe I wanted God to be telling me something specific. And so I moved in that direction. And then I was sad because, of course, it didn't work out because I acted on it too soon. I didn't ask for clarity or discernment. I felt like God was doing something, and so I assumed that I knew what he was doing without seeking the proper guidance from him. And so earlier when I talked about making decisions from a faithful place, the first one was not rushing in making those decisions. I think the same thing applies here. I don't think that we have to rush in trying to live out the things that we believe that God is telling us, because he will also tell you when it's time. There are some things that I had to let marinate in my heart for a while before God told me that it was time to move. And there are some things that are still marinating. Okay. This is when God is really working on that patience. All right. If you believe that he told you something, then he did. And we have to be patient enough to know that his timing is perfect. The other thing is, think about the frustration and confusion that you feel, and where is it actually coming from? Is it because you think that maybe God forgot about you, or is it because you are afraid of making the wrong decision, and so you're waiting for him to give you like step-by-step instructions so that you don't make a mistake? Like, what is the frustration really about for you? Or is it because you feel like God is stringing you along? You feel like he's stringing you along, and he's just, wanting to watch you squirm and be confused? We have to trust that God is not stringing us along, right? But instead, he might be inviting you to get more familiar with his voice in new and in different ways. As you are seeking that guidance and seeking that wisdom, a part of that is making sure and kind of fine-tuning your ear to God's voice. And so he might give you something, and that might be an invitation for you to get deeper into your word and to kind of fine tune that ear a little bit, so that you can make sure that you're hearing it correctly, so that you can make sure that you're hearing the other things that he's telling you. God speaks to us in many different ways, and he speaks to different people differently. Maybe he is in this season speaking to you in a new way, and he's inviting you to get to know him in that way. But we have to trust that if God is telling you to do something, if God is giving you an assignment, then he's going to give you all the materials necessary in order for you to complete that assignment successfully. We got to trust that. If you are seeking God and you're seeking God's will for your life, then he's not going to lead you astray. And even if you make a misstep, he already has a plan to get you back on the right track. The second part of our verse today says, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. He will direct your path. If we are acknowledging God and delighting in him and staying close to him, then he's not going to let you get too far off of that track. You're not going to get too far off of the path that he wants you to go, because you're always seeking his guidance for every step along the way. There are seasons, I think, when God is really loud and where he's speaking to us a lot. And there are seasons where maybe he's a little bit quieter and he's calling us into that solitude, and he's calling us to get to know him in different ways and to hear him in different ways. And so maybe that's a part of what's happening as well. God is always working. He's always doing something. So if you are not sure of the next step, then maybe this is a good opportunity to look into what else is God doing in my life right now. Maybe he gave me this word, gave me this assignment, and it's not time to move on it yet. In the meantime, what does he want me to learn about him? God does not waste anything. So if you're really seeking his voice and you are hearing him giving you something, giving you an assignment, giving you a direction, it is purposeful, and his timing is perfect and purposeful. So trust that timing. Trust his intention and trust his character. And hopefully that will mitigate some of the frustration and confusion that you feel. God is not the author of confusion. God is not the author of confusion, and he has not given you a spirit of fear. So seek God even in your frustration, and I believe that you'll find him. All right, y'all. I wasn't sure where that episode was going to go today, but as always, I believe that it probably went exactly where it needed to go. I hope that it was helpful for you. Let me know if it was. I love hearing y'all's thoughts about the show. So wherever you are watching or listening, leave a review or just your thoughts about what you felt about the episode. Thank you so much for listening. I love you so much, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Therapy and Prayer. Make sure you're subscribed and following wherever you listen to podcasts. And if the spirit moves you, go ahead and leave us a review. If you want to submit a question to be answered on this show, send us an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com. And make sure you're following us on TikTok at Therapy and Prayer. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you soon.